The sun beat down, baking the scrubland until the air shimmered, making ghosts of distant mountains. Jebediah squinted, dust clinging to his throat like a bad memory. He watched a rider, a shadow against the blazing sky, gallop toward the horizon. Then, just like that, the rider wasn't there. Vanished. Not a dust cloud, not a sound, just a vast, indifferent emptiness. A cold dread, sharper than any cactus thorn, pricked at Jeb's gut. Ghosts don't ride in daylight, do they? But the tracks were fresh, leading into the shimmering heat, and something told him this wasn't just a trick of the light. The relentless sun bore down on Jebediah, baking the earth until it cracked like an old man's knuckles. His ranch, the Lazy J, was less a home and more a promise whispered on the wind. A promise to his long-gone uncle, Silas, that he'd keep the land. Jeb was a man of the earth, as weathered and unyielding as the landscape he called home. His face, etched with lines of sun and worry, rarely betrayed the quiet turmoil within. His only constant companion, aside from the distant howl of coyotes, was Old Blue, a grizzled hound whose loyalty was as deep as the canyons. Blue, ever watchful, lay sprawled by the porch, one ear twitching at the flies, the other attuned to Jeb's every move. This morning, though, had started like any other. The metallic tang of coffee, the creak of saddle leather, familiar scent of horse and dust. Jeb was mending a fence line, the rhythmic clang of hammer on wire a comforting cadence. Then it happened. A rider, a dark silhouette against the relentless glare, appeared on the horizon, moving with an urgency that spoke of trouble or news. Jeb straightened, his hand instinctively going to the warm grip of his revolver. Strangers were rare in these parts, especially riders pushing their horses like the devil himself was on their tail. The rider was close enough now for Jeb to make out a tattered duster and a wide-brimmed hat. No familiar face. The horse was a blur, its hooves kicking up a plume of red dust. Then, just as Jeb was about to raise a hand in greeting, the rider simply wasn't there. One moment, a man and his horse, clear as day, galloping across the sun-drenched flat. The next, nothing. No stumble, no fall, no sudden swerve. Just gone. The dust cloud continued its slow drift, a lingering phantom of something that had been and now was not. Jeb stood frozen, the hammer in his hand forgotten. Old Blue, sensing the shift in his master, let out a low, questioning whine. The silence that followed was heavier than the midday heat, a vast, oppressive blanket. Jeb's heart, usually as steady as a rock, hammered against his ribs. His mind, accustomed to the practicalities of ranch life, grappled with the impossible. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was the heat playing tricks. But the tracks, clear and deep in the dry earth, continued past the point of vanishing. They led straight toward the desolate expanse known only as the Whispering Sands, a place folks whispered about in hushed tones, a place not on any map. A chill, unrelated to the searing heat, crept up Jeb's spine. His uncle Silas had vanished out there, years ago, under equally strange circumstances. A cold, hard knot formed in Jeb's stomach. This wasn't just a mirage. This was a sign. And a decision, stark and unavoidable, solidified in his mind. He had to follow those tracks. Jebediah followed the tracks, the sun a malevolent eye in the vast sky. Old Blue trotted faithfully by his side, his nose to the ground, sniffing at the strange, almost metallic scent that lingered in the air. The tracks, impossibly clear, led deeper into the Whispering Sands, a landscape that grew increasingly alien. The familiar scrub gave way to twisted, skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky like gnarled fingers. The sand itself shifted, the wind whipping it into stinging currents that scoured Jeb's face. The heat intensified, a suffocating blanket that pressed in on him, testing his resolve with every labored breath. He found the first obstacle near a stand of petrified wood, a deep fissure in the earth, too wide to jump, too steep to descend easily. The tracks continued on the other side, mocking him. Jeb dismounted, his gaze sweeping the jagged edges of the crack. He knew the risks. A wrong step here, a twisted ankle, and he'd be another ghost in the desert. But the image of the vanishing rider and the gnawing fear for Silas fueled him. He found a sturdy, sun-bleached branch, testing its weight, and then, with a silent prayer, used it to vault across, landing with a jarring thud. Blue, with a surprising agility for his age, scrambled across behind him. Further on, the air grew thick, not with dust, but with a strange, heavy silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, through the shimmering heat, Jeb saw it. A figure slumped against a rock. His hand went to his gun. As he approached, he saw it wasn't the vanished rider, but an old prospector, his face caked with dust, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended exhaustion. "Water," the old man croaked, his voice a dry rasp. Jeb offered his canteen. The prospector gulped greedily, then coughed, his eyes darting nervously around. "You shouldn't be here, son," he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. "This place. It ain't right. I'm looking for a rider," Jeb said, his voice flat. "Vanished, just now." The old man's eyes, already wide, somehow grew wider. He trembled, clutching the canteen like a lifeline. The midnight rider," he stammered, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror beyond Jeb's shoulder. "He comes in the daylight now. Takes him. Swallows him whole." "My Uncle Silas?" Jeb pressed, ignoring the old man's ramblings. "Did you ever see him out here?" The prospector's face contorted in a grimace. "Silas? Big man, scar over his eye? He came through here years back. Talked about a fortune, a hidden place, but he never came back from the town." "What town?" Jeb asked, his voice low. "The one that ain't on any map," the old man whispered, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Only those who are meant to find it do." He shivered violently, his body racked with a sudden spasm. "They take your breath, your hope, everything." Jeb tried to get more out of him, but the old man's words became jumbled. A desperate stream of warnings about shadows that moved against the light and whispers carried on the wind. As Jeb watched, a dark, feverish pallor spread across the prospector's face. His breathing grew shallow, ragged. A chilling realization struck Jeb. The old man wasn't just dehydrated. Something else was draining him. As the last vestiges of life flickered from the prospector's eyes, a cold, unyielding wave of defeat washed over Jeb. He had found a lead, a potential witness, but now, that chance, that fragile thread of hope, had just been extinguished. The desert had claimed another, and Jeb, for the first time, felt the suffocating grip of despair, knowing he was more alone than ever. The prospector's lifeless gaze, fixed on the empty sky, echoed the gnawing emptiness within Jebediah. He buried the old man as best he could, using a makeshift shovel fashioned from a broken piece of wood, the labor a grim counterpoint to his racing thoughts. The sun, indifferent, continued its relentless descent, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. As the last light faded, a chilling wind swept through the skeletal trees, carrying with it not just sand, but something else, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Silas. Found it." Jeb froze, his heart seizing in his chest. The whisper, barely audible, was like a ghost of a memory, stirring something deep within him. He closed his eyes, and the present blurred, replaced by a memory from years ago. The memory was vivid. A dusty, sun-drenched afternoon. Young Jebediah, no older than 10, sat on the porch swing, listening to his Uncle Silas's booming laugh. Silas, a man built of grit and dreams, was packing his saddlebags. "Got a tip, boy," Silas had said, his eyes gleaming with an adventurous spark that always captivated Jeb. "About a place." A place where the sun sets on a fortune, but only if you know where to look. He'd winked, a playful glint in his eye. Don't you worry, Jeb. Old Silas will be back, richer than a king, and we'll make this lazy Jay sing. But Silas never came back. Just a faded map, found weeks later in his cabin, its edges burned, leading nowhere. The town, marked with a faint X, was illegible. Jeb opened his eyes. The desert night suddenly colder, sharper. The whispers, now a faint rustle in the dry leaves, seemed to mock him. The town that ain't on any map. The prospector's dying words, combined with his uncle's old tale, clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. Silas hadn't just vanished. He had found it. And this vanishing rider, this midnight rider, who now rode in daylight, was connected. The landscape had changed subtly but profoundly. The sparse, thorny bushes gave way to more gnarled, ancient trees, their forms twisted into grotesque shapes by unseen forces. The ground beneath his boots was no longer just sand, but a mixture of crushed rock and something else, something that glittered faintly in the dim starlight, a strange black dust. It felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavy, pressing in on him, filled with a palpable sense of something ancient and malevolent. As he walked, a fresh wave of emotions, long suppressed, surged within him. Not just curiosity, but a profound sadness for Silas, a man who had been more than an uncle, a mentor, a father figure, a legend in young Jeb's eyes. And with that sadness came a simmering anger. Anger at the unknown force that had taken Silas and now threatened to claim others. He was no longer just following tracks. He was following a trail of unanswered questions, a trail leading to a reckoning. Ahead, through the deepening gloom, a faint shimmer appeared on the horizon, like heat haze, but pulsing with an unnatural light. It was the town, the ghost town. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He had two choices: turn back, save himself from whatever darkness lay ahead, and let Silas's fate remain a mystery, or press on, knowing the risks, knowing he might meet the same end as his uncle, but driven by a need for answers that gnawed his soul. The choice was a stark one: follow the cautious voice of reason or the relentless pull of a broken heart. He looked at the shimmer, then at the sky, a silent promise forming on his lips. He moved forward. The shimmer on the horizon solidified into a spectral outline of a town as Jebediah drew closer. Dust-choked buildings, their windows like vacant eyes, leaned against each other, whispering tales of forgotten lives. This was it, the town not on any map, the place where his uncle had vanished. A profound silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the crunch of Jeb's boots on the gritty main street. Even Blue seemed subdued, his tail tucked, his hackles slightly raised. Then, from the shadows of the saloon, a figure emerged. Tall, gaunt, wrapped in a tattered duster that billowed around him like a shroud. A wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, but Jeb felt an undeniable chill. This was the rider, the one who vanished, the one the prospector called the Midnight Rider. "You shouldn't have followed," the figure rasped, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to echo from the very dust. "This is not your place." Jeb's hand instinctively went to his revolver, his thumb resting on the hammer. "You know about Silas?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "My uncle. He came here." The rider took a slow, deliberate step forward. The air crackled with an unseen tension. Silas. He sought what was not his to claim. What did he claim? Jeb pressed, his eyes narrowing. "What is this place?" "A gateway," the rider hissed, his voice gaining a chilling resonance. "Between here and elsewhere. Those who come seeking power, seeking fortunes, they are consumed." Jeb saw a faint, unnatural glow emanating from beneath the brim of the rider's hat, and a cold dread settled deep in his bones. This wasn't just a man. "You took him, didn't you?" Jeb accused, his voice thick with a mix of fear and old, simmering rage. "You took Silas." The rider chuckled, a dry, rattling sound like bones dancing in the wind. "He chose his path, just as you are choosing yours, Cowboy." Suddenly, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, and the faint glow from the rider intensified, revealing not eyes, but swirling, dark voids. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very life was being sucked from it. "He wanted something," Jeb insisted, refusing to back down. "He wanted answers. And what do you want, Cowboy?" The rider countered, his voice now a chorus of disembodied whispers, circling Jeb from all directions. "To join him? To be a shadow in the sun, like all the others?" A blinding flash of light erupted from the rider, momentarily disorienting Jeb. He staggered back, raising an arm to shield his eyes. When his vision cleared, the rider was closer, impossibly close. A cold skeletal hand reached out, its touch like ice. Jeb felt his strength draining, a chilling emptiness seeping into him. Blue let out a terrified howl and bolted, disappearing into the shadows. The town around them seemed to melt and reform, the buildings swirling like smoke, the very ground dissolving beneath his feet. He was losing control, losing himself. All his strength, his resolve, his very essence seemed to be ebbing away, pulled into the vortex of the rider's unholy power. This was it, he thought, the end. He was about to become another vanished ghost, another echo in the unforgiving desert. Just as the darkness threatened to consume him, a faint, almost forgotten sound pierced the oppressive silence. The distant, mournful howl of a coyote, followed by a familiar, frantic bark. Blue, a spark of defiance, of stubborn human will, ignited within Jeb. He would not go quietly. With a desperate final surge of energy, he lunged, not at the rider, but at the ground beside him, grabbing a rusted piece of metal, a shard of a broken wagon wheel. He brought it down with all his remaining might, not expecting to harm the spectral figure, but to disrupt the terrifying grip. A low, guttural shriek tore through the air, and the rider recoiled, the overwhelming presence momentarily shattering. The shimmering town flickered, and the oppressive silence gave way to a sudden, deafening roar, as if the desert itself was awakening. Then, a blinding explosion of dust and light erupted from the center of the town, throwing Jeb backward, sending him crashing against a crumbling wall. Jebediah lay amidst the debris, the taste of dust and copper in his mouth. His head throbbed, and a searing pain shot through his shoulder. The blast had been concussive, throwing him like a rag doll against the crumbling adobe. The spectral glow of the town had vanished, replaced by an eerie, almost normal darkness, broken only by the sliver of a crescent moon. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed down on him, amplifying the ringing in his ears. Blue, whining softly, nudged his hand, a welcome, solid presence in the aftermath of the impossible. He pushed himself up, every muscle protesting, his mind a jumble of pain and fragmented memories. The rider, the whispers, Silas. It had been real. Too real. The confrontation had cost him, physically and emotionally. He felt hollowed out, as if a part of him had been ripped away. The encounter with the rider, the sheer overwhelming power, had left him feeling small, insignificant. He was just a cowboy, a man of the earth, trying to make sense of something beyond human comprehension. The familiar comfort of his solitude, which usually grounded him, now felt like a vast, empty chasm. Even with Blue by his side, he felt utterly alone, isolated by the unfathomable events he had witnessed. He stumbled through the dust, the ground still vibrating faintly. The town, though still standing, felt different now. Less spectral, more desolate. The buildings seemed to sag with a profound weariness, their secrets buried deep within their crumbling walls. He reached the center of the blast, where the rider had stood. There was no sign of the entity, no body, no lingering shimmer. Only a deeper crater in the dust, and something else, a small, worn, leather-bound journal, half buried in the debris. Jeb knelt, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The cover was faded, but the initials, Saltwood, were still visible. Silas, his uncle's journal. A lump formed in his throat. He opened it, the brittle pages crackling. The first entries spoke of his uncle's journey, his search for a hidden fortune. But then, the handwriting grew erratic, the words more frantic. Silas had found the town, he wrote, a place of immense power, a gateway to something ancient. He had tried to harness it, to control it, believing it would bring him endless wealth. But the entries devolved into desperate pleas, warnings of a malevolent presence, a watcher that fed on hope and life itself. The last entry was just a single scribbled word, gone. The journal offered brutal clarity. Silas hadn't just vanished. He had been absorbed, consumed by the very power he sought to control. And the writer? The writer was a part of that power, a guardian, or perhaps even a manifestation of it. The piece of a shattered wagon wheel that had caused the writer to recoil was a relic from the past, a symbol of human resilience against the supernatural. It was the only thing that had worked. Jeb looked at the journal, then at the vast, indifferent desert stretching out before him. He had found the answers, but they were grim. Silas was gone, irrevocably, and the entity was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. He could leave, walk away, put this nightmare behind him. But a new thought, cold and clear, began to form in his mind. The writer had recoiled from the mundane, the human. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight it, not with guns or brute force, but with something else, something human. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was a chance. A very high-risk chance, but the only one he had. He looked down at the journal. Its brittle pages, a testament to his uncle's ambition and ultimate demise. He knew what he had to do. With a deep, ragged breath, Jebediah, the weary cowboy, slowly rose to his feet, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders, doubt and courage walking hand in hand towards an uncertain dawn. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of bruised violet and pale gold, touching the desolate landscape with a fleeting beauty. Jebediah stood at the edge of the ghost town, the worn journal clutched in his hand. Blue lay beside him, head on paws, watching with somber eyes. The town was still, the silent testament to broken dreams and vanished lives. The metallic scent of ozone lingered from the previous night's confrontation, a stark reminder of the impossible. Jeb's body ached, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that went beyond physical pain. But his mind was clear, sharpened by the brutal truths he'd uncovered. Silas hadn't been a fool. He'd been a man driven by dreams, by the yearning for something more. And that yearning had been twisted, consumed. The Midnight Rider wasn't just a guardian. It was the embodiment of all that was lost and taken, a shadow feeding on what made men human. He didn't know if his plan would work. It wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It was about offering something the entity couldn't consume, something it might even fear. He walked back to the center of the town, to the crater where the rider had stood. He found a piece of smooth, flat rock, and with a shard of metal, he began to etch. He etched the lazy J brand, simple and true. He etched a small, crude figure of a man and a dog. He etched the memory of Silas's booming laugh, a silent prayer against the oppressive emptiness. As he worked, the faint whispers returned, swirling around him like a dry wind. They promised power, riches, the secrets of the universe. They offered escape from sorrow, from the burden of life. But Jeb knew their lure. He felt the cold touch of the entity, testing, probing. He didn't fight it. He simply kept etching, pouring his memories, his love, his grief into the stone. He thought of his uncle, not as a victim, but as a man who lived and loved. He thought of the simple joys of ranch life, the smell of rain on dry earth, the loyal companionship of Blue. He infused the stone with the very essence of humanity, the things the entity could never understand or consume. The whispers grew frantic, then faded. The cold touch receded. The air, heavy with malevolence moments before, grew lighter. The entity, whatever it was repelled by something it could not comprehend. Not power, but vulnerability. Not greed, but connection. He finished his etching, a simple, raw testament to a life lived. He placed the stone carefully in the center of the crater. The silence that followed was profound, a different kind of silence than before. Not oppressive, but reflective, as if the desert itself was breathing. Jebediah never saw the Midnight Rider again. The ghost town, however, remained. It was still there, but the unsettling aura had lifted. It was just a town now, a collection of crumbling buildings, a monument to forgotten dreams, but no longer a place of malevolent energy. He knew he couldn't stay. His journey had come to an end, and a new one was beginning. He was no longer just a cowboy tending to his ranch. He was a man who had faced the impossible and, in his own quiet way, had triumphed. He rode back towards the rising sun, the familiar scent of dust and sagebrush a welcome balm. The lazy Jay would be waiting, a little older, a little wiser. He thought of Silas, and for the first time in years, the memory didn't bring just sorrow, but a quiet sense of peace. His uncle hadn't found the fortune he sought, but he had, in a way, led Jeb to something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of himself and of the enduring power of the human spirit. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the land, Jebediah pulled his hat low. His story, whispered on the wind, was just beginning. He was a cowboy, and some ghosts, it turned out, could be reasoned with, even in daylight.